No one would have believed in the last years of the 19th century that this world would soon find itself under the sway of a singular work of fiction, which was to define a literary genre, challenge widely held beliefs, permanently alter our relationship with media, and somehow become the biggest joke on the internet.
Get away from that! Get out of there!
But this seminal masterpiece of social commentary is no laughing matter, for it still has much to say about us and the times we live in.
H.G. Wells' The War of the Worlds has exerted a lasting, ever-evolving influence since its publication in 1898. This classic tale of an alien invasion has become a timeless cornerstone of popular culture, which remains relevant in more ways than you might think. I'm Tyler Martin, and this is Monsters from the Id.
Astronomers observe strange flashes of light on the surface of Mars. Soon after, what seems to be a meteorite lands in the English countryside. This proves to be the first of many artificially manufactured cylinders from which beings from the Red Planet emerge, wielding advanced weapons that exceed human comprehension. A searing heat ray, lethal toxic gas, towering three-legged war machines, and more, which they use to wreak untold havoc. The mightiest weapons and military strategies are powerless against them. The narrator, a man of learning with a philosophical bent, is given much to ponder as he struggles to survive the chaos, encountering a colorful cast of characters who each respond to the calamity in their own very human ways. Not so much a hero as a simple survivor, he tells of individuals who fall into delusion or despair, and of hysterical masses fleeing in desperation, the rules of decent society forgotten in the midst of panic and destruction. He is appalled to find that the people of Earth are a source of sustenance for the Martians. It is surmised that they plan to capture and breed humans as livestock. Just when all hope seems lost, the machines begin to collapse, their pilots slain, not by any device or action of man, but by common bacteria against which their bodies have no defense. Having recently gained notoriety with works like The Time Machine, The Island of Dr. Moreau, and The Invisible Man, British novelist Herbert George Wells was in the midst of redefining what is now known as science fiction with revolutionary stories that offered ample food for thought. With The War of the Worlds, he took inspiration from the then prevalent genre of invasion literature, which drew on national anxieties of war and fanned the flames of jingoistic pride, and presented arguably his most influential text, one that introduced a quintessential template for sci-fi storytelling and came loaded with a searing indictment of views that his readers would have very much taken for granted. At the time, the British Empire was the mightiest power on Earth, spanning all across the globe and exerting enormous influence on the world stage. British readers of the day took it as a matter of course that the throne's sovereignty over supposedly lesser nations and peoples was due to the natural right of superior races and civilizations to hold dominion over those deemed inferior. With this firmly in mind, Wells presented a race of highly evolved extraterrestrials who have far surpassed human beings in terms of intelligence, technical ingenuity, and powers of destruction, against which humanity has no conceivable chance of victory. They feast on the blood of still living humans, reflecting the ruthless parasitic practices of earthly colonial aggressors. What is more, by making Britain the epicenter of their invasion, Wells issued a direct challenge to the perceived righteousness of royal dominance, a truly radical notion for the time. And before we judge of them too harshly, we must remember what ruthless and utter destruction our own species has wrought, not only upon animals, such as the vanished bison and the dodo, but upon its inferior races. The Tasmanians, in spite of their human likeness, were entirely swept out of existence in a war of extermination waged by European immigrants in the space of 50 years. Are we such apostles of mercy as to complain if the Martians warred in the same spirit? It should be noted that while Wells' language clearly reflects now outmoded beliefs in racial and cultural superiority, this was nevertheless a daring step forward for the period. His courage in citing and openly condemning this real-world example of unconscionable brutality at the hands of the British Empire would certainly have made an impression. Even so, Welles wasn't content to stop there, calling the whole notion of human supremacy itself into question. For that moment I touched an emotion beyond the common range of men, yet one that the poor brutes we dominate know only too well. I felt as a rabbit might feel returning to his burrow and suddenly confronted by the work of a dozen busy navvies digging the foundation of a house. I felt the first inkling of a thing that presently grew quite clear in my mind, that oppressed me for many days, a sense of dethronement, a persuasion that I was no longer a master, but an animal among the animals under the Martian heel. With us it would be as with them, to lurk and watch, to run and hide. The fear and empire of man had passed away. So it is not merely the British throne, but the empire of man itself that has been challenged. In the face of the Martian onslaught, we are as helpless as the animals that we, with our clever ingenuity and insatiable lust for power, have driven before us in the belief that we are masters of all we survey. The invaders view us in much the same way as we would any common beast, herded, confined, and bred as a source of food. It is far beyond our ability to cope with this threat, which has us thoroughly outclassed and outgunned. It is not by any human effort that this insurmountable threat is overcome, but by a quite unexpected turn of events, with the Martians dead, slain by the putrefactive and disease bacteria against which their systems were unprepared. Slain after all man's devices had failed, by the humblest things that God, in his wisdom, has put upon this earth. With human resilience and ingenuity rendered moot, it is these simple components of nature itself that triumph, the very nature that human civilization scorns and seeks to conquer, exploit, even annihilate as it pleases. The Martians, secure in their own superiority, are cut down by something exceedingly simple which their highly developed minds had failed to consider, an ironic twist that should give any reader cause for reflection. While exultant at this sudden turn of fortune, the narrator nonetheless takes the lesson to heart, observing that our own peace and security may not be as ironclad as previously thought. On its face, The War of the Worlds is an inventive, entertaining story of alien invasion, but as these and other passages illustrate, the author made no bones about his agenda, directly confronting what he saw as unacceptable attitudes and actions, and in the long run, history would come to see things his way. Now, when a world power wields its might to arbitrarily inflict harm upon or take possession of another, perhaps lesser equipped nation, condemnation is swift and widespread. But at the turn of the 20th century, Welles was in the minority. This man was clearly ahead of his time, and the rich subtext of The War of the Worlds remains alarmingly pertinent today, with the dangers of imperialism and hubristic folly dominating the news cycle. And speaking of news, as potent and successful as the story was in its own time, its power and influence did not end in Victorian England, for the Martian war machines would famously rise again decades later in the United States to prove that Welles' now classic tale still had a great deal to teach us about ourselves. The year was now 1938, and it was again a time of high tension and uncertainty. Citizens were reeling from the Great Depression, and Hitler's alarming rise to power in Germany had much of the world on edge. In addition, public interest in Mars was increasing, with many speculating on the possibility of life on the Red Planet. And what is more, the invention of radio had by this time revolutionized the media landscape, having become a vital source of both news and entertainment. It was in these circumstances that the other Welles in our story entered the picture in a very big way. Actor Orson Welles, then just 23 years old, was the creator and host of the CBS program Mercury Theater on the Air, a weekly anthology series which adapted classic literature and plays. With the help of writer Howard E. Koch, Welles devised a special edition for Halloween based on The War of the Worlds. Airing on October 30th, 1938, this retelling opens like an ordinary radio broadcast with a weather report and live music. The program is periodically interrupted with realistic news bulletins, interviews, and on-the-scene coverage reporting first on strange phenomena being observed on Mars, before quickly escalating into a full-scale invasion centered at Grover's Mill, New Jersey. Many key points from the novel are echoed faithfully as the Mercury Theater cast and crew convincingly portray an ever more desperate struggle against the overwhelming Martian attack, all in the form of a live news broadcast.
Wait a minute, something's happening. humped shape is rising out of the pit. I can make out a small beam of light against a mirror. What's that? There's a jet of flame springing from the mirror, and it leaps right at the advancing men. It strikes them head on. Oh, Lord, they're turning into flames. Now the whole field's caught up by the woods, the barns, the gas spreading everywhere. Coming this way now, about 20 yards to my right.
Ladies and gentlemen, due to circumstances beyond our control, we are unable to continue the broadcast from Grover's Mill. Evidently, there's some difficulty with our field transmission.
Some listeners, having tuned in partway through the program, apparently mistook it for the real thing. CBS was purportedly inundated with phone calls from alarmed citizens. Network executives demanded a break to assure the audience that what they were hearing was in fact a work of fiction. Wells somewhat belatedly complied, after which point the program took the form of a more conventional solo monologue, possibly from an earlier draft of the script before the news format had been decided on. It ends with the presenter calmly reassuring his audience that what they had heard was all meant in good fun. It was Halloween Eve, after all. The following day, newspapers reported mass hysteria from coast to coast as a result of this sensational broadcast. Telephone operators across the country would recount being swamped by terrified callers who were convinced that the Martian invasion was real. At least some in the audience, having only heard fragments of the program, believed the country was under attack by the Nazis, a much more probable scenario, especially given the circumstances of the day. In fact, later investigations would conclude that newspapers had greatly exaggerated the scale of the panic. Though it does appear that some listeners honestly believed the broadcast to be genuine, their numbers were nowhere near the millions reported in the press. It would appear that the papers had intentionally manufactured a widespread crisis in an attempt to discredit the newer medium of radio, which they considered a threat to their own livelihoods. Ironically, in so disingenuously attacking the credibility of their media rivals, they managed to cast doubt on their own integrity. The Mercury Theater controversy became the focus of the very first study on the impact of mass media on public behavior and opinion. Many concerned citizens demanded stricter media regulation to prevent misleading or sensationalistic news coverage. Indeed, this notorious incident marked a turning point in our relationship with media, whose repercussions are still being felt. In an age when social media and other outlets brim with specious news items, AI-generated hokum, and more, we would all do well to remember that just because a thing strikes a nerve or appeals to the emotions in some way, that does not necessarily make it true. Many more people today are swept up in misinformation than were ever sent into a panic over that notorious 1938 radio play. With the very definition of the word fact now a source of heated debate, it is the duty of every citizen of every nation to weigh information soberly and honestly, a duty at which too many of us are failing. For his part, Orson Welles, when questioned by reporters and law enforcement, gave every impression of innocence, insisting that there had never been any intention to mislead the public, though years later he would tell a different story.
In fact, we weren't as innocent as we meant to be when we did the Martian broadcast. We were fed up with the way in which everything that came over this new magic box, the radio, was being swallowed. People, do suspect what they read in the newspapers and what people tell them, but when the radio came, and I suppose now television, anything that came through that new machine was believed. We wanted people to understand that they shouldn't take any opinion predigested, and they shouldn't swallow everything that came through the tap, whether it was radio or not.
Whatever his true intentions, this event made a bona fide sensation out of the rising star, who was allegedly offered a chance to create a motion picture version of the War of the Worlds. It is said that he passed on this opportunity in favor of his own pet project, the revolutionary Citizen Kane, which interestingly enough deals with media manipulation of public opinion. Coincidence? H.G. Wells' story did eventually make its way to film in 1953, when producer George Pal and director Byron Haskin unleashed their take on the novel to great acclaim. Changing the setting to Cold War-era America, this version differs in many ways from the original text, but the core concepts remain intact, and much like the book, it became the de facto template for alien invasion narratives on the silver screen. The astounding special effects, helmed by Gordon Jennings, netted the film an Academy Award, and Albert Nozaki's inspired design for the Martian war machines remains one of the most iconic images in science fiction. This landmark adaptation is remembered as one of the greatest genre pictures of its day, and the definitive screen version of Welles' novel. Other retellings naturally followed, with Steven Spielberg taking an admirable swing in 2005. Updated to the post-9/11 world, this version likewise takes a number of liberties with the source material, but is nonetheless a reasonably solid and respectful take on the story, effectively incorporating Welles' essential ideas while introducing new ones which mostly succeed. As of this recording, the 2025 version, directed by Rich Lee, will be fresh in the memory of anyone who has recently stepped within spitting distance of the internet, where it has been lambasted from virtually every corner. Released directly to streaming, this exceedingly loose interpretation was produced during the COVID-19 pandemic. The drama unfolds entirely on computer and smartphone screens, with principal characters rarely appearing in the same place at the same time. Featuring Ice Cube as a government agent who helps thwart an alien invasion brought on by his boss's reckless actions, this disorienting barrage of product placement for various tech-related products and services bears almost no connection to the novel, and has little merit of its own to stand on. Though, like Welles' original, this version does warn against a false sense of security, it inadvertently condemns the human tendency to hubris in quite a different way. Just because a cynical corporate giant has the option to half-heartedly adapt a public domain title doesn't always mean it should, as the results can be quite regrettable. With its evergreen premise and potential for adaptation, The War of the Worlds has been molded into various other forms over the years, from television to comics, video games, and even an influential concept album by musician Jeff Wayne. These many renditions have met with varying degrees of success, but all help to illustrate the timelessness of H.G. Wells' groundbreaking vision. In the right hands, this story can enrich the hearts and minds of audiences, and even expose flaws in our collective mentality. But even when a new take misses the mark, there are still lessons to be learned. Its impact can be felt everywhere, from the profusion of invading extraterrestrials in science fiction, to the way we interpret fantastic stories, both plainly fanciful and those taken to be real, and even to the way we perceive our place among one another, in nature and the universe. And these are just some of the reasons why The War of the Worlds still matters.
Before we end today's episode, I would like to acknowledge War of the Worlds Central for providing a treasure trove of information and insight into this classic work of science fiction. You can find links to this and other key sources in the description. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and subscribe for more Monsters from the Id. As always, thank you for joining me. I'll see you next time.